The dust of Ethel tasted of rust and forgetting. For 100 years, it had been the only taste Ilara knew. She moved through the skeletal remains of the first landing zone, a place the architects called the Great Salvage, her worn mag boots crunching softly on the red grit. Above, the thin, engineered atmosphere was a pale, perpetual twilight, the sun a hazy coin behind a veil of atmospheric nanites. The nanites were a gift, the architects said. They regulated the air, shielded from radiation, and quieted the mind. They scrubbed away the harsh edges of existence, the sharp sting of sorrow, the chaotic fever of joy, the useless burn of anger. They left only a placid, manageable grayness, a perfect state for efficient labor. Ilara was an efficient laborer. Her designation was Scrapper 734, and her task was to sift through the bones of her ancestors, pulling valuable old-world alloys and salvageable circuit boards from the rust-eaten husks of the initial colony. She worked with her head down, her movements economical, her thoughts as smooth and shallow as a desert stream. That was how you survived. You didn't remember. You didn't feel. You just worked. The old world, the one before the architects arrived in their silent, silver ships and remade Mars in their own sterile image, was a ghost. Its history was relegated to a single, sanitized paragraph in the public data cores, a failed, chaotic settlement of emotionally unstable primitives who had nearly rendered the planet uninhabitable before the architects' benevolent intervention. The descendants of those primitives, Ilara's people, were now wards of the architect's synod, given purpose, given peace, given the gift of emotional silence. They were not slaves. The architects insisted they were protected from the messy, violent legacy of their own nature. Ilara believed it, the way one believes in the ground beneath their feet or the air in their lungs. It was simply the state of things. Then she found the box. It was buried deep within the collapsed command center of the Odyssey, the flagship of the first landing, a vessel so ancient its name was known only to the architect archivists. A seismic shift had cracked open a section of the hull that had been sealed for a century, revealing a small, airtight compartment. Inside, nestled in decayed acoustic foam, was a manty black case, no bigger than her hand. It wasn't made of the pitted steel or corroded aluminum she usually salvaged. This was something else. A carbon composite weave that felt unnervingly warm to the touch. It bore no markings, no insignia. It was shielded, she realized, not just from radiation, but from the pervasive electronic hum of the architect's surveillance grid. Curiosity was a flicker, a ghost of an emotion she hadn't felt since she was a small child, quickly suppressed. Protocol demanded she report the find. Anomalous artifacts were the property of the Synod. Her hand trembled as she reached for her comms unit, but something stayed her. A whisper from a place deeper than thought. A gravitational pull toward the unknown. That night, in the sterile quiet of her habitation pod, she opened it. Inside lay a single slate, its screen as dark and smooth as obsidian. When her thumb brushed its surface, it didn't activate with the familiar blue glow of architect tech. It flared to life with a riot of color. There was no interface, no menu. It was a raw data stream, a torrent of pure, unfiltered information that bypassed the nanites in her bloodstream and slammed directly into her consciousness. It was like being struck by lightning. She saw a sky that was a deep, impossible blue, not the hazy tan of Ethel. She heard music, a chaotic symphony of strings and drums and a human voice that soared with a feeling so powerful it made her chest ache. She saw faces, thousands of them, crinkled with laughter, wet with tears, contorted in rage, illuminated by love. She saw them painting on cavern walls, dancing around bonfires under the true, unfiltered stars of the Martian night, holding hands and fighting. They were fighting, not with the cold, precise plasma weapons of Arctech Sentinels, but with crude projectile rifles and salvage mining tools, their faces grim with a terrifying, beautiful defiance. Personal logs flickered through her mind, a geologist describing the thrill of discovering liquid water in the Valle Marineris, a mother's lullaby sung to a newborn in the first-ever Martian nursery, a soldier's last, desperate letter to a lover, written from a barricade during the Unification War, the war the architects claimed never happened. Alara collapsed to the floor, gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs with a wild, alien rhythm. Her head was a storm of noise and color, grief, sharp and suffocating, for people she had never known, a fierce, protective love for a culture she never lived, and, beneath it all, a single, searing ember of rage. The nanites in her blood fought back, trying to smother the inferno, to reduce the symphony to a single, gray note. But the slate in her hand pulsed with a gentle warmth, a shield against the encroaching calm. For the first time in her life, Alara felt, and her first true feeling was the devastating realization that her entire existence had been a lie. The world didn't turn gray overnight. In the days that followed, Alara was a ghost haunting her own life. The slate hidden in a tear in her pod's insulation. The quiet obedience of her fellow scrappers, once a comfort, now felt like a funeral procession. The pristine, ivory towers of the architect's city of Apex, gleaming on the horizon, no longer looked like a beacon of benevolent progress. They looked like a tombstone on the grave of a murdered world. She saw everything through new eyes. She noticed the faded geometric patterns painted on the walls of the oldest ruins, realizing they weren't random scrawls, but a form of art. She began to hear the ghost of a melody in the way the oldest scrappers sometimes hummed, a tune that echoed the music from the slate. She saw the way the architects, in their form-fitting, silver environment suits, looked down at her people not with malice, but with a detached, clinical pity one reserves for a domesticated animal. Her awakening did not go unnoticed. On Apex, within the Panopticon, Overseer Kale monitored the biometric rhythms of the Scrapper caste. He was a biosociologist, a student of the primitive Martian psyche. To his colleagues, the native population was a solved problem, a resource to be managed. But Kale saw them as a beautiful, flawed artifact, a living echo of humanity's chaotic origins. His work was to ensure their placidity, to fine-tune the nanite protocols for maximum efficiency and minimal distress. His algorithms were perfect, but recently, one signal had begun to deviate. Scrapper 734. Her cardiac rhythm was subtly erratic. Her neural wave pattern showed spikes of REM activity during waking hours, a biological impossibility. The nanites reported momentary, systemic failures in her bloodstream before correcting themselves. It wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't a threat. It was an anomaly, a beautiful, fascinating flaw in the system. Kyle didn't dispatch a sentinel squad. Instead, he requisitioned a long-range optical drone, its lens no bigger than a grain of sand, and tasked it with a simple directive: watch her. He wanted to understand this ghost in his machine. Driven by the storm in her mind, Ilara began to take risks. She stopped salvaging for the architects and started searching for herself. She looked for more shielded compartments, more hidden caches, anything that might hold another piece of the truth. She found scraps: a child's doll with a faded, smiling face, a book whose paper pages crumbled to dust at her touch, leaving behind the scent of ink and time, a harmonica, which she blew into one night, producing a lonely, mournful sound that felt more real than anything the architects had ever built. The drone watched it all, relaying the data to Kale, who cataloged her every move with growing fascination. He saw her tracing the faded murals with her fingers. He saw her weeping silently in her pod at night. He saw her staring at the stars, a new, dangerous light dawning in her eyes. The anomaly was evolving. One cycle, while scavenging in the shadow of the old communications array, she saw him, an old man, Silas, chipping away at a rock face, his back to the rest of the work crew. He wasn't salvaging. He was carving. With a sharpened piece of rebar, he was etching a complex, swirling pattern into the stone, identical to one she had seen on a warrior's shield in the data slate's archives. Their eyes met across the dusty expanse. There was no flicker of recognition in his gaze, only the same placid grayness as everyone else. But as he turned away, he left the piece of rebar on the ground. A deliberate act. That night, she found a new carving on the wall of the communal sanitation block, a map of tunnels deep within the ruins, a place her scrapper schemas marked as structurally unsound. It was a test, an invitation. Following the map felt like stepping off a cliff. The tunnels were dark and tight, the silence absolute. She moved through the forgotten underbelly of the first city for what felt like hours. The slate clutched to her chest like a second heart. Finally, she saw a faint light ahead. She emerged into a vast cavern, a geothermal vent warming the air. And she was not alone. A dozen people were gathered there, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of bioluminescent fungi cultivated on the walls. She saw Silas, his eyes no longer gray, but a sharp, intelligent blue. He smiled, a true smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "We were wondering when you'd wake up," he said, his voice a low rumble, unused to speaking above a whisper. This wasn't a resistance. It was a sanctuary, a hidden hospital for those whose nanite suppression had failed, those who had started to remember and were drowning in the flood. They were the awakened. An old woman showed Ilara how to meditate, to focus the chaotic storm of emotion into a single point of clarity. A young man taught her the words to the songs from the slate, his voice cracked and hesitant but filled with a passion that made the cavern echo. Here, in the heart of the ruins, the ghost of old Mars was alive. Silas led her to the center of the cavern, to a large, cylindrical device humming with a low energy. The Firsts knew the architects were coming, he explained. They couldn't win the war, so they fought for memory instead. This is a memory core, a library of our soul. He gestured to a port on its side. Your slate is a key. It holds a piece of the map. Let's see what door it unlocks. As Ilara connected the slate to the core, a new torrent of information flooded her mind, clearer and more powerful than before. The complete, unredacted history of her people, their science, their art, their laws, their dreams. But as the history of her world was returned to her, an alarm blared in the panopticon on Apex. Kyle leaned forward, his eyes wide with scientific rapture. The anomaly was no longer a single, flickering light, but a blazing bonfire. He had found its source. Ilara barely had time to register the new memories before the ground began to shake. A high-pitched whine cut through the air as bright, surgical lights flooded the cavern entrance. 3 architect sentinels, sleek, insectoid machines, descended from the tunnel, their plasma casters glowing with cold, blue energy. The awakened scattered in terror. The sentinels moved with terrifying efficiency, firing stun bolts that left bodies twitching on the cavern floor. Silas shoved the slate back into Ilara's hands. "Run," he yelled, turning to face the machines, his body armed with nothing but memory. "They can't erase it if one of us remembers run." A bolt of blue energy engulfed him. Ilara didn't hesitate. She scrambled into a narrow fissure at the back of the cavern, the sounds of the massacre fading behind her. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, collapsing in a dark, forgotten tunnel. Alone. The sanctuary was gone. Her people were captured or dead. She was no longer just a scrapper who remembered. She was the last librarian of a dead world, and the architects finally knew she existed. The silence that followed the massacre was a different kind of quiet. It was not the placid, engineered emptiness of the architect's world, but a heavy, ringing void filled with the ghosts of screams. Ilara lay curled in the darkness of the fissure, every muscle trembling, her mind a maelstrom of Silas's final, desperate shout and the chillingly efficient hum of the Sentinel's plasma casters. Grief was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in her chest that made every breath an act of rebellion against the nanites trying to soothe her, to scrub the horror clean and return her to the gray. She fought them. For the first time, she actively pushed back against the chemical peace, focusing on the sharp edges of her pain, hoarding the agony like a precious fuel. It was all she had left of them. The slate in her hands was warm, a steady, living presence against her cold skin. Silas's words echoed in the void. "They can't erase it if one of us remembers." It was no longer a discovery. It was a burden, a sacred, terrifying duty. She wasn't Scrapper 734 anymore. She was a vessel, a library walking through the ruins of its own history, and her pursuers were the ones who had burned the books. On Apex, Overseer Kale watched the data stream from the cavern with a dispassionate, scholarly intensity. The operation had been crude, a standard security protocol, automatically triggered by the power surge from the memory core. He hadn't ordered the strike, but he wouldn't mourn its necessity. The captured subjects were already in biological stasis, their neural patterns being meticulously mapped. They were a treasure trove of data on the awakening phenomenon. But the prize, the catalyst, had escaped. On his main holoscreen, the live biometric feed for Scrapper 734 was a frantic, jagged line of red. Her cortisol levels were off the charts, her heart rate a frantic drum solo. The nanites in her system were working overtime, dumping suppressants into her bloodstream, but her biology was actively rejecting them. It was beautiful. A perfect feedback loop of trauma-reinforcing resistance. He had to have her. He had to have the slate. "Isolate her designation," Kale said to the empty room, his voice calm. The Panopticon's AI responded instantly. "Broadcast a sector-wide alert. Scrapper 734 has been compromised by a cognitive contagion. She is unstable and a danger to the community's emotional hygiene. Isolate and report. Do not engage. He smiled faintly. He wouldn't hunt her with sentinels. That was like using a sledgehammer for neurosurgery. He would hunt her with her own people. He would turn the placid, gray world she knew into a cage, where every familiar face was a warden and every comforting routine a trap. He activated a new protocol, one of his own design. He linked the atmospheric nanite cloud to the central surveillance grid, turning the very air of the Great Salvage into a single, massive sensor. Every breath she took, every bead of sweat that evaporated from her skin would now betray her location. The anomaly would have nowhere to hide. Alara crawled from the fissure as the first hint of engineered dawn bled across the sky. The world outside was terrifyingly normal. Work crews were already moving through the salvage fields, their heads down, their movements as rhythmic and predictable as ever. But now, she saw the subtle network of optical sensors shimmering on the high ruins, the faint energy signature of the patrol drones overhead. The world had not changed, but her perception of it had it was a prison, and she was its only conscious inmate. Her comms unit chirped. A robotic, synthesized voice, the one used for all public announcements, echoed from the speakers on the salvage crawlers. Alert. Scrapper 734 is compromised. A cognitive contagion. Isolate and report. Her own face, pulled from a work roster file, flashed onto the small screens of her coworkers' wrist units. They looked up, their gray eyes scanning the landscape with a dull, programmed suspicion. One of them, a man she had shared nutrient paste with just the cycle before, pointed a trembling finger in her direction. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her grief. She was an outcast, a disease. She scrambled back into the shadows of the ruins, her heart pounding. The slate pulsed in her hand. Desperate, she activated it, not for the memories of art or music, but for something else. War. The Unification War logs. Schematics of the old colony's infrastructure flooded her mind. She saw the city as it was, not as it is. Hidden conduits, collapsed metro tunnels, emergency shelters. A secret geography buried beneath the architect's sterile order. Her ancestors were giving her a map to escape. Her first challenge was the open ground between her position and the old maglev transit network. The area was swarming with scrappers and patrolled by architect drones. She was trapped. As she hid behind a mountain of rusted plating, a small, six-wheeled vehicle trundled past. It was an old M5 maintenance unit, a relic the architect still used for simple tasks like dust removal and diagnostics. Its programming was so ancient and simple, it was barely connected to the main grid. An idea sparked, born of desperation and the tactical memories of a long-dead soldier. The slate showed her the M5's internal schematics and command protocols. The access port was on its undercarriage. She waited for it to pass behind a derelict fusion core, then darted out, sliding under its chassis. Her fingers, nimble from years of salvaging microcircuitry, found the port. She interfaced the slate. The screen glowed, lines of ancient code scrolling past. She didn't understand it, but the memories did. She wasn't hacking the machine. She was speaking its native language. She entered a single command, a continuous, low-priority diagnostic loop targeting a remote, abandoned sector. The drone, which she now thought of as Unit 5B, stopped its patrol. Its optical sensors dimmed slightly as its primitive processor was consumed by the pointless task. It was now blind to its surroundings, moving only along the path she had designated. She clung to its underbelly, the metal cool against her cheek, and it carried her unseen across the open ground, a ghost hiding beneath a ghost. Kyle watched the blip that was Scrapper 734 vanish from the nanite grid. He wasn't angered, he was intrigued. The atmospheric sensors showed her biometric signature merging with the heat and energy output of an old M5 unit. It was a clever, this primitive form of camouflage. She was adapting. Learning. He cross-referenced the M5's designation and route. It was on a standard cleaning patrol, but then it deviated, heading toward the decommissioned Sector Gamma. She wasn't just hiding, she was using the system against itself. Ingenious, he whispered, a genuine smile touching his lips. He brought up a new schematic on his screen. The network of seismic sensors buried beneath the entire colony. They were designed to detect quakes, but he could recalibrate their sensitivity. He could listen for her footsteps. The hunt had just become more interesting. For days. Ilara lived in the secret spaces of her world, guided by the slate and shielded by Unit 5B. The drone became her mobile sanctuary. It couldn't feel or think, but its simple, predictable presence was a comfort. During the long, silent hours, she devoured the information on the slate. She learned that the thin, engineered atmosphere was a lie. Mars had been fully terraformed by her ancestors, capable of supporting a breathable atmosphere and open water. The nanites weren't just for regulation. They were a delivery system for the suppressants and a veil to hide the vibrant, blue sky that should have been above her head. The architects hadn't saved a dying planet. They had conquered a living one and put its people to sleep. The rage that this knowledge stoked in her was a clean, cold fire. It burned away her fear, leaving a diamond-hard resolve. She wasn't just trying to survive anymore. She was going to tear the veil. But to do that, she needed leverage. She needed a place to think, a sanctuary beyond the reach of the panopticon. The slate gave her a destination. Tucked away in the war logs was a reference to a black site, a pre-architect installation so secret it had been wiped from most records, the Pharos Observatory. It was built atop Olympus Mons, the highest point on the planet, far from the colony. It had its own geothermal power source and, most importantly, its own isolated atmospheric systems, theoretically beyond the reach of the nanite cloud. It was a fortress of the old world. The journey would be treacherous, a long trek across the desolate Martian plains, but it was her only hope. She began to gather supplies, using Unit 5B to haul small caches of salvaged power cells and nutrient packs to a rendezvous point at the edge of the Great Salvage. It was on one of these runs that Kale's net finally tightened. She was moving through a narrow canyon of scrap metal when a tremor ran through the ground. It wasn't a quake. It was a pulse, rhythmic and deliberate. Seismic sensors. She froze. The pulse echoed again, closer this time. He was mapping her position by the vibrations of her footsteps. She looked at her feet, then at the silent, wheeled drone beside her. An idea, cold and desperate, formed. She climbed atop Unit 5B, her feet leaving the ground entirely. The seismic pulses continued, but now they swept past her. Unable to distinguish her weight from the drones, she had blinded his new eyes. Kyle watched the footfalls vanish from his seismic map, while the M5 drone continued its inexplicable journey toward the edge of the salvage zone. He laughed, a short, sharp bark of genuine appreciation. She was learning faster than any subject he had ever studied. This was no longer just an anomaly to be contained. This was a conversation, and he was eager to hear what she would say next. Elara clung to the drone, her knuckles white, as it trundled toward the vast, open desert that separated the ruins from the distant, towering peak of Olympus Mons. The great salvage, her home, her prison, her entire world shrank behind her. Ahead lay a wilderness of red dust and unfiltered stars, a landscape haunted by the ghosts of her ancestors. She was alone, hunted by an unseen god who listened to the air and felt the ground, armed with nothing but a drone and the truth. The journey to the Pharos had begun. The desert was a sea of red, vast and indifferent. The perpetual twilight of the salvage zone gave way to a sky of raw, unfiltered blackness, punctured by the fierce, cold light of a billion stars. Elara had never seen them before, not like this. The nanite veil thinned as she moved further from the architect-controlled sectors, and the sight was so overwhelming, so majestic and terrifying, that she could only lie on the chassis of Unit 5B and weep. They were tears not of grief, but of a profound, soul-shaking awe. This was her sky. This was the sky her ancestors had looked upon, the sky they had painted and sung about and navigated by. The architects hadn't just stolen her people's minds, they had stolen their universe. The journey was a brutal meditation. By day, the unfiltered sun was a harsh, blinding glare, forcing her to shelter in the shadow of rock outcroppings, while Unit 5B's solar panels soaked up the energy. By night, the temperature plummeted to lethal lows, and she huddled against the drone's warm internal reactor, listening to the wind scour the plains. She was utterly alone, a single, moving speck in an ocean of desolation. The slate was her only companion. She no longer just read the files, she inhabited them. She learned to navigate by the stars using the logs of an old-world surveyor. She learned to identify edible lichen from the field notes of a first-landing botanist. She learned the foundational principles of atmospheric physics, the very science her ancestors had used to give Mars its breath. The breath the architects now choked with their chemical peace. On Apex, Kyle tracked her progress with a mixture of clinical detachment and rising admiration. His seismic sensors were useless out here, and the nanite cloud was too thin for precise biometric tracking. He was forced to rely on long-range satellite imagery, which only gave him periodic snapshots of a tiny drone crawling across the Tharsis Montes. He could have dispatched a flight of sentinels to intercept and retrieve her at any time, but the thought felt artless, unscientific. This was a unique experiment, a study of a primitive mind under extreme pressure, armed with the ghosts of its own forgotten technology. To end it with brute force would be to spoil the data. Instead, he decided to introduce a new variable. He accessed the architect's weather control grid, a system of orbital mirrors and atmospheric heaters used to prevent catastrophic dust storms. He didn't create a storm. That would be too obvious. He simply nudged a high-pressure system, subtly altering the wind patterns, creating a slow-moving but inescapable corridor of abrasive, high-velocity dust directly in her path. It wouldn't kill her, but it would shred the drone's external sensors and solar panels. It would strand her. It was a test of ingenuity, a challenge from one intelligence to another. The wind came first as a whisper, then a hiss, then a roar. Red dust, fine as flour, began to whip across the landscape, reducing visibility to mere feet. Elara's suit filters worked overtime, but the abrasive grit was relentless. An alarm chimed from Unit 5B's control panel. Its optical sensors were failing, scratched into blindness. Soon, its solar panels would be rendered useless. They were driving blind into a wall of razor-sharp wind, with their power source slowly being flayed. Panic, cold and familiar, began to creep in. She pulled up the surveyor's logs on the slate, cross-referencing them with the drone's last known coordinates. According to the old maps, they were near a region of ancient lava tubes, a subterranean network carved by volcanoes millions of years ago. It was their only chance for shelter, but with the drone sensors gone, she had no way to find the entrance. She was about to be buried alive. Then, a memory from a different file surfaced a geologist's report on the unique magnetic properties of the volcanic rock in the region. The first had mapped the tubes not with light, but with magnetometers. Unit 5B's internal guidance system had a basic magnetometer. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on a century-old scientific paper. She interfaced the slate with the drone's navigation system, bypassing the fried optical inputs and routing control directly to the magnetometer. The world dissolved into a chaotic swirl of magnetic field lines on her screen. She was no longer seeing the storm, she was seeing the bones of the planet. Following the faint, branching patterns of magnetic variants described in the report, she guided the drone through the howling darkness, a blind pilot navigating an invisible road. The entrance to the lava tube was a barely perceptible dip in the terrain, a place they would have missed by miles with sight alone. Unit 5B trundled down the slope and into the sudden, absolute silence of the earth. The storm raged on above, but down here, there was only the cool, still darkness and the steady hum of the drone's reactor. She had survived. She had beaten the storm he had sent for her. Kale watched the drone's satellite signal vanish into a geological anomaly. He cross-referenced the coordinates with the Planetary Survey archives. Lava tubes. He leaned back in his command chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. He had thrown a storm at her, and she had countered by learning to read the planet's magnetic soul. This was no longer an experiment. It was a game, and his opponent was proving to be a master. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in decades. A ghost of an emotion that the Synod's own conditioning was supposed to have eradicated respect. He decided to reward her. He would give her a clue, a piece of the puzzle that would lead her deeper into the mystery of her own past, and, in doing so, reveal her ultimate intentions to him. He delved into the deepest, most classified archives of the Panopticon, to the raw data logs from the architect's initial arrival, files that predated the official, sanitized history. He found what he was looking for, a record of a massive, anomalous energy reading from the Pharos Observatory, dated from the final day of the Unification War. The energy signature was not consistent with any known human technology. It was alien, biological. He redacted the most sensitive data, leaving only the energy signature graph and the coordinates, and packaged it into a simple, anonymous data burst. Then, using a decommissioned deep space comm satellite, he aimed it at the lava tube. Inside the tube, Alara was working. Using the drone's manipulator arms and schematics from the slate, she was stripping plating from its chassis to reinforce the damaged solar panels. It was slow, painstaking work. Suddenly, a notification pinged on the slate. It wasn't from the internal archive. It was an incoming signal. Her blood ran cold. He had found her, but it wasn't a threat. It was a single, cryptic file, a graph showing a wild and organic energy spike, and a set of coordinates. The coordinates of the Pharos Observatory. It was a message. A taunt. "I know where you're going. Here's a little mystery for when you arrive. Who would send this an architect? It didn't make sense. Why help her? Why guide her? Unless this wasn't just a hunt. Unless it was an invitation. The storm passed after 2 cycles. Ilara emerged from the lava tube into a world scrubbed clean. The red dust settled. The air crisp and cold. Olympus Mons loomed on the horizon, a titan of a mountain whose peak scraped the edge of space. The Pharos was up there, waiting for her. And now, it held not just the promise of sanctuary, but the lure of an even deeper truth. She was no longer just a librarian running from a fire. She was a detective, following a trail of breadcrumbs laid by her own jailer. The game had changed. The climb would be the most difficult part of the journey. The air would thin. The temperatures would drop further, and the terrain would become a treacherous maze of cliffs and crevasses. She modified Unit 5B, equipping its wheels with salvaged metal shards for traction and jury-rigging a supplemental oxygen line from its internal maintenance tanks to her suit. As she began the slow, arduous ascent, she felt a profound sense of purpose. She was climbing not just a mountain of rock, but a mountain of history, toward a truth that an enemy, for his own inscrutable reasons, seemed determined for her to find. The final moves of the game were about to be played on the highest stage on Mars, and she was beginning to suspect that survival was no longer the prize. The prize was the board itself. The ascent of Olympus Mons was a climb into the heavens. Ilara and Unit 5B moved like diligent insects up the face of a god, the curvature of Mars becoming visible below them, the vast, scarred plains stretching to a horizon that was no longer a line, but a gentle, planetary arc. The sky here was a bruised purple-black, a permanent state of pre-dawn, and the stars didn't twinkle. They burned with a steady, ferocious intensity. The air grew so thin that her suit's recyclers worked constantly. A soft, rhythmic hiss that was the only sound besides the crunch of the drone's wheels on the volcanic scree. The cold was a living thing, a predator that seeped through every seal and joint, forcing her to periodically press herself against the drone's reactor core to stave off the insidious creep of hypothermia. The slate was her guide, her teacher, her Bible. She followed the trail of a century-old expedition, their path marked by magnetic waypoints and journal entries that spoke of the same awe and terror she now felt. "The silence up here is not empty," wrote the lead climber, a woman named Anya Sharma. "It is full of the planet's own breathing. We are truly on sacred ground." Ilara felt it too. This was a place of power, a place that felt ancient and aware, far from the sterile, managed world of the architects below. Kale watched her climb from the panopticon, a silent, omniscient observer. The satellite imagery was crisp in the thin, clear air. He saw her navigate a crevasse field with a patience and precision that his own predictive algorithms couldn't have bettered. He saw her rigging a makeshift winch from the drone's manipulator arm to haul it up a sheer rock face. She was no longer just surviving. She was mastering her environment. She was becoming what her ancestors had been: an explorer, an engineer, a pioneer. The thought sent a dissonant chord of something akin to pride through his carefully conditioned psyche. He was the shepherd, and his lost lamb was proving to be a wolf. The Synod Council had begun to send inquiries. The anomaly. Scrapper 734 had been at large for too long. Her continued evasion was a statistical improbability, a flaw in his otherwise perfect management of the Martian wards. They questioned his methods, his passive observation. They wanted the anomaly contained, the slate secured, and the experiment terminated. He placated them with assurances and fabricated reports of logistical difficulties. But he knew his time was running out. He needed her to reach the Pharaohs. He needed to see the conclusion of his grand experiment. He needed to know what would happen when the primitive mind, armed with its own forgotten history, finally confronted the secret the architects had buried. The Pharos Observatory was not the ruin she had expected. It was a crown of obsidian-like rock and fused metal, built directly into the caldera of the volcano. Its main dome was a single, massive lens of crystalline material that seemed to drink the starlight. As she approached, a low hum vibrated through the ground. The unmistakable thrum of a geothermal power plant still active after a century of silence. The main entrance was a colossal blast door, sealed shut. There was no keypad, no external access port. According to the slate, the door was operated by a quantum-entangled key, a device long since lost to time. She was standing at the threshold of her sanctuary. Locked out, she circled the perimeter, the wind whipping at her, the cold gnawing at her bones. Then she saw it. A small, almost invisible inscription carved into the rock beside the door, written in the swirling script of the old world. Look not to the hand, but to the eye. It was a riddle, a line from a pre-architect poem she had read on the slate. She looked up at the great domed lens of the observatory. The eye. It was staring out at the cosmos, a silent, unblinking sentinel. What was it looking at? She accessed the observatory's original mission parameters on the slate. It was an exoplanetary survey telescope, but its primary, classified objective was to monitor a specific faint red dwarf star system, Gliese 581. The logs noted that the system was the source of a repeating, patterned radio signal, the first potential evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. The signal had stopped abruptly the same week the architects had arrived. The riddle wasn't just a poem, it was an instruction. She pulled up the astronomical charts and calculated the current position of the Gliese system. It was below the horizon. She would have to wait. For 16 agonizing hours, she huddled with Unit 5B, her body stiff with cold, her mind racing. As the planet turned, the red dwarf star finally crested the horizon. At the precise moment its light first touched the observatory's massive lens, a section of the rock wall beside the blast door hissed and retracted, revealing a narrow, dark opening. The door hadn't been locked by a key. It was locked by the stars themselves. The air inside was stale but breathable. The temperature a blessedly stable cool. The interior was a cavern of silent, dormant technology. Hollow emitters, control consoles, and data conduits lined the walls, all dark. The geothermal plant was providing power, but the main systems were offline. Following the schematics on the slate, she made her way to the central control room. It was a circular chamber directly beneath the main lens, the ceiling a transparent dome showing the starfield above. In the center of the room was a single command chair and a console, dark and lifeless. This was the heart of the Pharaohs. As she stepped into the room, the systems flickered to life. Soft, blue light bathed the chamber, and the main console illuminated, displaying a single, stark message, biosignature authenticated. Welcome back. Director Anya Sharma. Anya Sharma, the climber from the journal, the woman who had felt the planet's breath. Alara looked at her own hands, then at the console. It had read her DNA. She was a descendant. This place had been waiting for her. for one of Sharma's bloodline to return. A new set of files unlocked on the slate. A final, personal log from the director herself. They are here. The entry began, her voice strained, full of a dread that echoed across the century. Silent silver ships. They disabled our comms, our defenses, everything. They aren't hostile, not in the way we understand it. They are gardeners, and they have decided we are a weed. They claim to offer peace, a release from the burden of chaotic emotion. It's a lie. It's a cage. I have sealed the pharaohs. It will only open to my blood and the light of the signal's origin. I am converting the main power core to broadcast a single, compressed data packet, everything we are, our history, our art, our folly, a message in a bottle, thrown into the cosmic sea. But I am also leaving something else behind, a seed, a weapon. If you are reading this, my child, it means the bottle never reached its shore. It means we were silenced. The weapon is in the core chamber. It is not a bomb. It is a choice. May you have the strength to make it. Ilara's heart pounded. A weapon. A choice. Guided by the new schematics, she made her way to the geothermal core, deep in the mountain's heart. The chamber was a sphere of humming machinery, focused on a central, pulsating orb of light. Suspended within the light was a crystalline matrix, shifting with internal, biological patterns. The energy signature was a perfect match for the graph Kyle had sent her. This was the source. This was the seed. As she approached, the console beside the core lit up. It explained the weapon's nature. It was a symbiotic biological agent, engineered by the first's greatest xenobotanists. It was designed to interface with the architect's nanite technology. It was not a virus that would destroy them. It was a catalyst. Once released into the atmospheric nanite cloud, it would seek out every nanite and rewrite its core programming. It would sever the link to the panopticon, and it would disable the emotional suppression protocols. It wouldn't kill the architects. It would simply wake everyone up. It would return fear, joy, grief, and rage to every human on Mars in a single, instantaneous, planet-wide wave. The resulting psychological shock, the log predicted, would be catastrophic. Mass panic, riots, anarchy. A world of placid sheep suddenly remembering they were wolves. It would be the end of the architect's control, but it might also be the end of Martian civilization itself. This was the choice, a peaceful, gray prison, or a violent, chaotic freedom. As she stood before the pulsating core, her hand hovering over the activation sequence, a new message appeared on the screen. It was not from Anya Sharma. It was live. A fascinating dilemma. Isn't it the text scrolled? Order or chaos? The gilded cage or the bloody wilderness, I must confess. I do not know which outcome you will choose, but I am immensely eager to find out. Make your choice. Scrapper 734, your shepherd is watching. Kyle. He had been watching her the entire time. The taunts. The cryptic clues. He hadn't been hunting her. He had been guiding her here. He had wanted her to find this weapon. He wanted to see what she would do. He had turned her entire struggle, her grief, her rebellion, into the final variable in his sick, twisted experiment. The cold fire of her rage, which had been a steady ember for so long, erupted into a supernova. He thought this was a game. He thought he was the one in control. She would show him what a real anomaly looked like. The rage that consumed Ilara was unlike any emotion she had experienced before. It was not the hot, quicksilver fury from the war logs, but a cold, dense star of a feeling, a gravitational point around which her entire being now collapsed. Kyle's message, his casual, clinical curiosity, was a violation far deeper than the massacre in the cavern or the theft of her people's sky. He had taken her pain, her struggle for truth, and reframed it as a data point. He had made her the rat in his maze, and now he was waiting to see if she would press the lever for the food pellet or the electric shock. The choice Anya Sharma had laid before her, the silent cage versus bloody freedom, was suddenly insignificant. It was his choice, his dilemma. A binary trap set by the very intelligence that had imprisoned her world. To choose either path was to play his game, to validate his experiment, to give him the conclusion he craved. She would not. She would shatter the board. Her eyes scanned the core chamber, not for the activation panel, but for something else. The slate in her hand, now an extension of her own mind, cross-referenced the observatory's schematics with the principles of atmospheric physics she had learned. The weapon was designed to be released as an aerosolized agent, piggybacking on the nanite cloud to spread across the planet. But the broadcast array, the massive, powerful transmitter Anya had repurposed to send her message in a bottle, was still linked to the same geothermal power source. It was designed to convert matter into a tightly focused energy beam and fire it at the stars. An idea, wild and terrifying and beautiful, that took shape in her mind. It was a third option, an impossible choice that wasn't on Kyle's multiple-choice test. She began to work, her movements swift and sure. She was no longer just a scrapper. She was the inheritor of a century of forgotten science. The daughter of a world of engineers and dreamers, she bypassed the weapon's dispersal protocols, physically severing its connection to the atmospheric vents. Instead, she began rerouting the geothermal energy conduits, creating a direct, shielded channel from the symbiotic agent in the core to the heart of the broadcast emitter. She was not going to release the weapon onto Mars. She was going to fire it into space. In the panopticon, Kael watched in stunned silence. His predictive models, which had been running simulations of the two most likely outcomes, activation or refusal, were now generating cascading error messages. Her actions were illogical, irrational. She was dismantling the very weapon she had risked everything to find. He saw her rerouting the power, interfacing the biological core with the deep space transmitter. He couldn't comprehend her strategy. Was she trying to destroy the agent, a pointless gesture? Was she trying to communicate with it? Impossible. His mind, for the first time, was confronted with a truly unknown variable. He felt a prickle of something he had only read about in historical psych profiles of his own species' fear. He dispatched a squadron of high-velocity sentinels, ordering them to the Pharaohs with a single, brutal directive: contain the anomaly, seize the asset, lethal force authorized. But he knew it was too late. The journey to Olympus Mons took hours, even for his fastest machines. The game he had so carefully orchestrated was spiraling out of his control. Ilara worked against time, the thrum of the powering-up transmitter vibrating through the floor. She was wedding the most advanced biotechnology of old Mars with its most powerful communication technology. She wasn't building a weapon, she was building a voice. Her target was not the people of Mars, it was him. It was the entire Architect Synod. The symbiotic agent was designed to interface with nanites and rewrite their programming. and the architects themselves, in their sterile silver suits, were not gods. They were a post-biological species, their consciousness integrated into a swarm of nanites that constituted their physical forms. This wasn't just a seed to wake up humanity. It was a key that could unlock, or rewrite, the very soul of her oppressors. She aligned the broadcast array, not toward some distant star, but toward the single, brightest point of light in the Martian sky, the Panopticon itself. Kyle's seat of power on Apex. The final sequence was ready. She stood before the console, her hand hovering over the activation panel. This was her choice. Not order or chaos. Not freedom or servitude. It was a choice between a targeted conversation and a planetary scream. A new message flashed on Kyle's private screen, overriding all other data. It was from her. One sentence. "Are you watching closely?" Shepard. Then she pressed the button. There was no explosion, no sound, just a silent, invisible beam of concentrated, weaponized information. A biological code wrapped in a carrier wave, fired from the peak of Olympus Mons across the curve of the planet. It struck the Panopticon's primary comm spire like a bolt of lightning. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the lights in Kyle's command center flickered and died. The holoscreens went dark. The hum of the environmental controls ceased. He was plunged into a sudden, terrifying silence. The symbiotic agent, designed to rewrite human-linked nanites, flooded his systems. It did not kill him. It did something far worse. It severed his connection to the Panopticon's network, the collective consciousness of his people. It ripped away the layers of sterile logic and emotional conditioning. And, for the first time in his long existence, Overseer Kyle was alone, trapped inside his own singular mind. And then, the memories came, not his own, but hers. He felt the grit of the red dust. He saw the impossible blue of a forgotten sky. He heard the mournful cry of a harmonica in a dark tunnel. He felt the searing grief for a man named Silas, the fierce loyalty to a drone named Unit 5B, the cold, diamond-hard rage of a woman who refused to be a statistic. Her entire journey, her pain, her triumph, her awakening, it all flooded into his consciousness, not as data to be observed, but as an experience to be felt. He collapsed to the floor, his silver form trembling, a choked alien sound escaping him. He was drowning in the ocean of a single human soul. The effect cascaded. The Panopticon was the hub of the entire architect network on Mars. As its core intelligence fractured under the weight of Alara's memories, the system broke down. Across the planet, the atmospheric nanite cloud lost its central command. The emotional suppressants stopped flowing, and like a switch being flipped, Mars woke up. It was not the bloody chaos Anya Sharma had feared. It was a global moment of profound, painful, beautiful clarity. In the great salvage, a scrapper dropped his tools, looked at his own hands, and began to weep, though he didn't know why. In the architect city of Apex, a technician looked up from her console and saw the face of her coworker for the first time, not as a functional unit, but as a person, and felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of affection. The wave of returned emotion was not a tidal wave of violence, but a flood of pure, overwhelming sensation. There was confusion. There was fear. But above all, there was wonder. The sky began to change. As the nanite veil dissipated, The hazy tan bled away, revealing the deep, impossible blue of a living world. A collective gasp echoed across the planet as millions of people looked up and truly saw their home for the first time. Alara stood in the control room of the Pharaohs, watching the starfield through the dome. The slate in her hand went dark. Its purpose served. She was just a woman again, standing on a mountaintop, breathing free air. She did not know what would come next. A new world had just been born, a world of feeling, chaotic people who would have to learn how to live with the ghosts of their past and the uncertainties of their future. There would be conflict, there would be pain, but there would also be art and music and love and the freedom to look at the stars and choose your own destiny. The Sentinels never arrived. Her message hadn't just disarmed Kale, it had disarmed the entire system. On the floor of the silent panopticon, Kyle curled into a ball, his mind endlessly replaying Ilara's memories. He had wanted to understand the anomaly. Now, he was the anomaly. He had been the shepherd, and in the end, his lamb had not just broken out of the pen. She had taught the shepherd what it felt like to be a sheep. The age of architects was over. The age of humanity, in all its messy, beautiful, and terrifying glory, had begun anew, not with a bang, but with a single, collective, waking breath under a true blue sky.